In the summer of 1986, Nancy Daugherty was living her quiet life in Chisholm, Minnesota. The 8-year-old mother had recently separated from her husband and was rebuilding her independence in the small Iron Range town where everyone knew each other. She was known for her kindness, her infectious laugh, and her gentle way with neighbors. But on July 16th, when Nancy failed to show up for work, a welfare check would shatter this peaceful community forever. Police found her body in her modest home. She had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled. The brutality shocked a town that had never seen such violence. Investigators collected DNA evidence using primitive 1980s technology, but the case went cold for decades. Then, nearly 40 years later, genetic genealogy would finally point to an 8-year-old who had lived just 1 mile away. But would justice truly be served after so much time had passed? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The streetlights of 4th Avenue cast long shadows across Nancy Daugherty's small home as she tidied her living room on the evening of July 15, 1986. The phone rang, and she settled into her favorite chair to chat with a friend about plans for the next day. Her laugh echoed through the quiet house as she talked about work, about her children, about the simple hopes that filled her days. Outside, Chisholm slept peacefully. This Iron Range town of fewer than 5,000 people had always been a place where neighbors looked out for each other, where doors stayed unlocked, and where the most serious crime was usually a Saturday night bar fight. Nancy had grown up here, raised her children here, and even after her recent separation from her husband, she felt safe in the community that had always embraced her. As the conversation wound down, Nancy glanced at the clock and promised to call her friend tomorrow after work. She hung up the phone and moved through her evening routine, unaware that these would be her final peaceful moments. The woman who had touched so many lives with her kindness was preparing for a night that would end in unimaginable horror. The house grew quiet, except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of laughter from neighbors enjoying the warm summer evening. Nancy turned off the lights one by one, checked the locks, and headed to bed. Tomorrow would bring another ordinary day in Chisholm, or so she believed. But evil was already moving through the darkness toward 4th Avenue. Morning arrived with the harsh ring of a telephone at Nancy's workplace. Her supervisor checked the clock with growing concern. Nancy Daugherty was never late, never missed work without calling. Something was wrong. The welfare check request went out just after 10 a.m. Police officer Dale Burkholtz drove slowly down 4th Avenue, noting the quiet normalcy of the tree-lined street. Nancy's house looked peaceful from the outside, but when he knocked on the front door, the silence that answered chilled him to the bone. Brian Evenson arrived shortly after the police. As Nancy's friend and former boyfriend, he had been asked to assist with the welfare check. His face was pale with worry as he followed Officer Burkholtz around the house, looking for signs of Nancy's whereabouts. They found the basement window first. The screen had been removed and carefully set aside. The window itself was open, creating a dark portal into the house below. Officer Burkholtz radioed for backup before entering through the front door, which Nancy's landlord had unlocked with trembling hands. The scene inside would haunt every person who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. Nancy lay in her bedroom, her body bearing the evidence of a violent struggle. She had fought her attacker with desperate courage, but in the end, evil had prevailed in this house where kindness had once lived. Within minutes, 4th Avenue transformed from a quiet residential street into a crime scene. Police cars lined the curb, their red and blue lights painting the neighbors' faces with an otherworldly glow. Yellow tape stretched across Nancy's small yard like a barrier between the innocence that had died and the harsh reality that now began. The sirens echoed through downtown Chisholm, drawing people from their homes and businesses. Word spread quickly through the tight-knit community. Nancy Daugherty, the woman who had smiled at everyone, who had helped her neighbors without being asked, who had brought casseroles to new mothers and visited the elderly, was gone, and someone among them was a killer. The news hit Chisholm like a physical blow. In coffee shops and grocery stores, on street corners and in church pews, people whispered the same questions. How could this happen here? Who could do such a thing to Nancy? The Chisholm Police Department had never investigated a murder like this. Chief investigators called for assistance from the Street, Louis County Sheriff's Office, and the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. Soon, forensic experts descended on the small town, their presence a stark reminder that innocence had been lost forever. Detective Sergeant Gary Waller took charge of the investigation. A seasoned officer with decades of experience. He had seen violence before, but the brutality inflicted on Nancy Daugherty shook him. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This was something darker, more calculated. The evidence collection began immediately. In 1986, DNA analysis was still in its infancy, but investigators carefully preserved biological samples found at the scene. They photographed everything, measured every detail, and collected items that might someday yield answers. Neighbors gathered in small groups, their faces etched with fear and disbelief. Mrs. Anderson, who lived 3 houses down, remembered hearing what sounded like screams around 2 a.m. But in the darkness, she couldn't tell where they had come from. Mr. Peterson, who walked his dog every morning, recalled seeing an unfamiliar figure near Nancy's house sometime before dawn, but the details remained frustratingly vague. The coroner's van arrived as the sun reached its peak, and the sight of Nancy's body being wheeled out under a white sheet broke something fundamental in the community's sense of safety. Children were called inside early that evening. Doors that had never known locks were secured for the first time in decades. Father Mackenzie, from St. Mary's Catholic Church, walked slowly up 4th Avenue as the afternoon shadows grew long. He had known Nancy since she was a child, had watched her grow into the compassionate woman who had touched so many lives. Now he would have to find words to help a community understand why evil had visited their peaceful streets. The investigation was just beginning, but already, one truth was becoming clear. Chisholm would never be the same. Detective Sergeant Gary Waller spread the case files across his desk in the cramped police station. In the week since Nancy's murder, his team had conducted over 50 interviews, but the puzzle remained frustratingly incomplete. Brian Evenson had been among the first to be questioned extensively. As Nancy's former boyfriend and one of the people who discovered her body, he naturally drew investigative attention. The interviews revealed a complicated relationship. They had dated, broken up, but remained friends. Brian admitted to visiting Nancy regularly, sometimes helping with household repairs. During his questioning, Brian appeared genuinely distraught. He spoke of Nancy with obvious affection, describing her laugh, her kindness to everyone in the neighborhood. But Detective Waller noted inconsistencies in his timeline for the night of July 15th. Brian claimed he had been home alone, watching television, but couldn't remember specific programs or provide witnesses to corroborate his alibi. The forensic evidence was more promising but technologically limited. Semen samples had been collected from Nancy's body, along with skin cells found under her fingernails where she had fought against her attacker. In 1986, these samples could provide blood type information, but the sophisticated DNA analysis that would later revolutionize criminal investigation was still years away from practical application. Other suspects emerged from the community canvas. A drifter had been seen in town the week before the murder, but he had moved on and proved difficult to track. A former boyfriend from Nancy's past was investigated and cleared. Every lead was pursued, with the desperate hope that one would provide the breakthrough the case needed. The investigation consumed the small police department. Officers worked double shifts, following up on tips that came in from as far away as Duluth. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension assigned additional agents to assist with the case, bringing sophisticated investigative techniques to bear on Chisholm's first murder in decades. But as summer turned to fall, the leads began to dry up. The initial flood of tips slowed to a trickle. Witnesses' memories became less reliable as time passed. The case that had once seemed solvable through sheer determination began to feel like it might slip away into the darkness, where so many crimes disappear forever. Detective Waller refused to give up. He kept Nancy's photograph on his desk, a constant reminder of the promise he had made to find her killer. St. Mary's Catholic Church had never held a funeral quite like Nancy Daugherty's. The small sanctuary overflowed with mourners, forcing the doors to remain open so those standing outside could hear Father Mackenzie's words. Nancy's children sat in the front pew, their faces pale with grief that seemed too heavy for their young shoulders. Behind them, the people of Chisholm filled every seat: neighbors, co-workers, childhood friends, and strangers who had been touched by the kindness of a woman they barely knew. Brian Evenson sat near the back, his eyes red with tears. Despite the questions that swirled around him, he had loved Nancy in his own complicated way, and her loss felt like a piece of his soul had been torn away. The suspicious glances from other mourners cut deep, but he couldn't bring himself to stay away from her funeral. Father Mackenzie spoke of Nancy's life with gentle reverence. He remembered the little girl who had sung in the church choir, the teenager who had volunteered at the summer festivals, the young mother who had brought her children to Sunday services with patient devotion. But even his practiced words seemed inadequate to capture the essence of a woman whose murder had shattered so many assumptions about safety and community. The hymns rose and fell like waves of grief washing over the congregation. Amazing Grace echoed through the church as tears flowed freely. Nancy's favorite, How Great Thou Art, brought sobs from those who remembered her beautiful voice, joining the choir on countless Sunday mornings. Detective Waller stood at the back of the church, his trained eyes scanning the crowd. Sometimes killers attended their victims' funerals, drawn by a perverse need to witness the pain they had caused. He studied every face, looking for signs of inappropriate emotion or behavior that might provide a clue. As the service ended and the processional began, the entire community seemed to move as one toward the cemetery. The graveside service was brief but profound. Father Mackenzie offered final prayers as Nancy's casket was lowered into the earth of the town that had shaped her life. One by one, mourners dropped flowers onto the casket. Nancy's daughter lingered longest, whispering promises that her mother's killer would be found, that justice would eventually prevail. It was a promise that would sustain her through decades of waiting. The crowd dispersed slowly, reluctant to leave Nancy alone in the ground. But as the sun set over Chisholm, one truth remained. Somewhere among them walked the person who had destroyed an innocent life. The investigation would continue, and eventually, Detective Waller believed, the truth would emerge from the shadows. By winter of 1986, the Nancy Daugherty investigation had consumed hundreds of hours and followed dozens of leads to dead ends. Detective Waller's desk remained cluttered with witness statements, forensic reports, and photographs that told the story of a brutal crime but failed to identify its perpetrator. The DNA samples collected at the scene had been sent to the few laboratories capable of genetic analysis, but the technology remained primitive. Blood typing could narrow the suspect pool somewhat, but it couldn't provide the definitive identification that would come with later advances in forensic science. Brian Evenson continued to be a person of interest, brought in for additional questioning as investigators tried to resolve the inconsistencies in his timeline. Each interview revealed more details about his relationship with Nancy, the jealousy he had felt when she dated other men, the anger that had surfaced during their breakup, the complicated emotions that had kept them connected despite their romantic separation. But inconsistent stories and suspicious behavior weren't enough for an arrest. The physical evidence didn't definitively point to Brian, and his emotional reactions seemed consistent with grief rather than guilt. Investigators needed more: a witness, a confession, or forensic evidence that could withstand scrutiny in court. Other leads continued to emerge sporadically. A man matching Brian's description had been seen near Nancy's house on the night of the murder, but the witness couldn't make a positive identification. A suspicious vehicle had been noticed in the neighborhood, but it was never located. Each potential breakthrough dissolved under closer examination. The community pressure was immense. Citizens demanded answers, protection, justice for Nancy. Town meetings grew heated as residents expressed their frustration with the pace of the investigation. Some pointed fingers at Brian Evenson, convinced that his proximity to Nancy and his presence at the crime scene made him the obvious suspect. Detective Waller felt the weight of every expectation. He had promised Nancy's family that her killer would be found. But as 1986 drew to a close, that promise seemed increasingly difficult to keep. The case was becoming what every investigator dreaded: a cold case that might never be solved. On the last day of the year, Detective Waller carefully packed the evidence files into storage boxes. The active investigation would continue, but with reduced intensity, as new crimes demanded attention. Nancy's case joined the ranks of unsolved murders that haunted police departments across the country. But Waller made one more promise as he sealed the boxes. Someday, somehow, technology would advance enough to unlock the secrets hidden in those carefully preserved DNA samples. Nancy Daugherty would have her justice, even if it took decades to achieve. The years passed with cruel indifference to the pain that Nancy's murder had left behind. Her children grew up in the shadow of unanswered questions, learning to live with the knowledge that their mother's killer walked free somewhere in the world. Nancy's daughter carried the heaviest burden. As the oldest child, she felt responsible for keeping her mother's memory alive and ensuring that the case never disappeared completely from public consciousness. She maintained contact with Detective Waller, calling periodically to ask about new developments, to remind him that Nancy's family still waited for justice. The case file moved from detective to detective, as retirements and transfers reshuffled the department. Each new investigator brought fresh eyes to the evidence, but the fundamental obstacles remained unchanged. The primitive DNA technology of the 1980s simply couldn't extract enough information from the samples to identify a suspect definitively. Brian Evenson gradually faded from active suspicion, though he never completely escaped the whispers that followed him through Chisholm. He moved away eventually, seeking a fresh start in a place where people didn't remember his connection to Nancy's murder. The change of scenery didn't erase his memories of the woman he had loved, or the suspicion that had branded him as a potential killer. New detectives would occasionally revisit the case, drawn by the horrific nature of the crime and the tantalizing possibility that advancing technology might finally provide answers. They would read through the witness statements, study the crime scene photographs, and examine the evidence with hope that gradually faded into resignation. The 1990s brought significant advances in DNA analysis, and Nancy's case was among those selected for review using new techniques. The results were more detailed than anything available in 1986, but still not precise enough to identify a specific individual. The suspect pool narrowed slightly, but not enough to make an arrest. Nancy's grave became a pilgrimage site for her family. Especially on the anniversary of her death each July, they would gather at the small headstone, sharing memories and renewing their commitment to finding her killer. The flowers they left wilted in the summer heat, symbols of hope that bloomed and died with each passing year. Detective Waller retired in 1998, carrying the weight of Nancy's unsolved case with him into his golden years. He had worked hundreds of investigations during his career, but Nancy's murder remained the one that haunted his dreams. He kept a copy of her photograph in his home office, a reminder of the promise he had never been able to fulfill. The new millennium arrived with technological promises that seemed to offer hope for cold cases everywhere. But for Nancy's family, the passage of time only deepened their sense of loss and frustration. The year 2020 brought a revolution to cold case investigations that would have seemed like science fiction to the detectives who first worked Nancy's case. Genetic genealogy, the process of using public DNA databases to identify suspects through familial connections, had begun solving cases that had been dormant for decades. Detective Sergeant Jason Whalen inherited Nancy's case files when he joined the St. Louis County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit. Unlike his predecessors, he had access to tools that could potentially extract answers from evidence that had waited 34 years for justice. The preserved DNA samples from Nancy's murder were carefully removed from cold storage and transported to a specialized laboratory. Using advanced extraction techniques, scientists were able to develop a much more detailed genetic profile than had ever been possible before. The profile was uploaded to genealogical databases, where millions of people had voluntarily shared their DNA information to trace family histories. Within weeks, the computer algorithms began identifying potential familial matches, distant cousins and relatives who shared genetic markers with Nancy's killer. Detective Whalen worked closely with genetic genealogist C.C. Moore, who had gained national recognition for her work on cold cases. Together, they began building family trees, tracing genetic connections back through generations to identify the common ancestors who linked the database matches to the unknown suspect. The work was painstaking and methodical. Each potential family line had to be researched thoroughly, with births, deaths, marriages, and geographic movements all factored into the analysis. The killer could be anywhere in the country by now, but the genetic evidence would eventually lead investigators to his door. As 2020 progressed, the family tree began to take shape. The suspect appeared to be descended from Scandinavian immigrants who had settled in northern Minnesota in the late 1800s. The genetic genealogy narrowed the possibilities to a handful of family lines, all with deep roots in the Iron Range region. Detective Whalen felt a familiar excitement building as the investigation gained momentum. For the first time in decades, Nancy's case had a clear path forward. Science had finally caught up to the evidence that had been waiting patiently for justice. The breakthrough came in the fall of 2020. After months of genealogical research, investigators identified a potential suspect, Michael Allen Carbo, Jr., who had been just 18 years old at the time of Nancy's murder and had lived within a mile of her home. The name meant nothing to Detective Whalen, but it represented everything to Nancy's family. After 34 years, they finally had a face to attach to their nightmares. Michael Allen Carbo, Jr., was living a quiet life in Virginia, Minnesota, when Detective Whalen and his team began their surveillance in late 2020. Now, in his early 50s, he had built what appeared to be a normal existence, far removed from the violent crime that had defined Nancy's family's lives for decades. The investigation proceeded with careful precision. Surveillance teams documented Carbo's daily routines, his work patterns, his social connections. Nothing in his current life suggested the capacity for violence, but investigators knew that murderers often successfully concealed their true nature for years or even decades. The crucial moment came when Detective Whalen decided to approach Carbo directly. Rather than attempting to collect DNA evidence covertly, he chose the straightforward approach of requesting a voluntary sample. The decision was calculated. If Carbo was innocent, he would likely cooperate. If he was guilty, his reaction might provide valuable insights. The confrontation took place on a cold December morning, outside Carbo's workplace. Detective Whalen identified himself and explained that he was investigating an old case that might be connected to Carbo's family line. The genetic genealogy had identified him as a person of interest, but a DNA sample would quickly resolve any questions. Carbo's reaction was carefully noted by the surveillance team. He appeared surprised but not alarmed by the request. After asking a few questions about the investigation, he agreed to provide a cheek swab sample. The casual cooperation seemed to suggest innocence, but investigators had learned not to make assumptions based on initial reactions. As a backup measure, the surveillance team also collected discarded items from Carbo's garbage, coffee cups, tissues, anything that might contain DNA evidence. The multiple samples would ensure that the comparison was conclusive and couldn't be challenged in court. The samples were rushed to the laboratory for analysis. After 34 years of waiting, Nancy's family was finally within days of learning the identity of her killer. Detective Whalen called Nancy's daughter personally to inform her that the case was nearing a resolution. The call came on a Friday afternoon in January 2021. The laboratory supervisor's voice was calm but definitive. The DNA samples from Michael Allen Carbo, Jr., were a perfect match for the evidence collected at Nancy's murder scene. After more than 3 decades, they had found her killer. Detective Whalen sat in silence for several minutes after hanging up the phone. The magnitude of the moment was overwhelming. Justice delayed but not denied. A promise finally fulfilled. A family's long nightmare finally approaching its end. The arrest warrant was prepared immediately, but Carbo would remain free for several more months while prosecutors built their case. The DNA evidence was conclusive, but after 34 years, they wanted to ensure that every aspect of the prosecution was perfect. Nancy's killer had been living freely for 34 years, but his time was finally running out. The arrest of Michael Allen Carbo, Jr., on April 13, 2022, sent shockwaves through the communities of northern Minnesota. The news that Nancy Daugherty's 6-year-old murder had finally been solved spread quickly through the Iron Range, reviving memories and emotions that many residents thought they had buried forever. Detective Whalen personally made the arrest at Carbo's home, accompanied by a team of investigators who had worked on the case for years. Carbo offered no resistance and showed little emotion as the handcuffs were applied. His neighbors watched in stunned silence as he was led to the police car that would transport him to jail. The charges were severe: first-degree murder while committing criminal sexual conduct. The DNA evidence was overwhelming. Not just a match, but a perfect genetic identification that left no room for doubt about Carbo's presence at the crime scene during Nancy's murder. Nancy's daughter received the call she had been waiting 36 years to hear. Through tears of relief and renewed grief, she listened as Detective Whalen explained that her mother's killer was finally in custody. The news was simultaneously vindication and reopened wound. Justice was coming, but it could never bring Nancy back. The media attention was immediate and intense. Cold case arrests always attracted coverage, but the 36-year gap between crime and resolution made Nancy's case particularly compelling. Reporters descended on Chisholm, interviewing longtime residents who remembered the murder and the fear it had brought to their community. Brian Evenson, now living in another state, learned of the arrest through news reports. For decades, he had lived under the shadow of suspicion, knowing that some people still believed he had killed Nancy. The DNA evidence that cleared him was a form of vindication, but it couldn't erase the pain of being suspected of murdering someone he had loved. The Louis County Attorney's Office began preparing for what would be one of the most high-profile trials in the region's history. The case presented unique challenges. Witnesses had died or moved away, memories had faded, and the defense would certainly argue that the passage of time made a fair trial impossible. But the DNA evidence was unshakable. Michael Allen Carbo Jr. had been 18 years old when he brutally murdered Nancy Daugherty, and genetic science had finally connected him to his crime. The wheels of justice, delayed for 36 years, were finally beginning to turn. As Carbo sat in jail awaiting trial, Nancy's family began preparing for the emotional ordeal of reliving the worst day of their lives in open court. Justice was within reach, but the path to closure would require them to endure one more painful chapter in their long journey toward healing. The trial of Michael Allen Carbo, Jr. began in the summer of 2022, drawing national attention to the small Iron Range community that had waited decades for this moment. The Louis County Courthouse in Duluth became the focal point for a legal proceeding that would finally determine whether justice could be achieved after such an extended delay. Prosecutor Rebecca Gould presented the state's case with methodical precision. The DNA evidence was the cornerstone of her argument, scientific proof that left no doubt about Carbo's presence at the crime scene. Expert witnesses explained the genetic genealogy process that had identified him, the statistical impossibility that the DNA belonged to anyone else, and the reliability of forensic evidence that had been carefully preserved for 36 years. The prosecution also reconstructed the crime itself, using evidence and witness testimony to paint a picture of the brutal attack that had claimed Nancy's life. Crime scene photographs, now faded with age, showed the violence that had shattered Chisholm's sense of safety. Medical examiner testimony detailed the injuries Nancy had sustained, the evidence of sexual assault, and the struggle she had mounted against her attacker. Nancy's daughter testified with quiet dignity about her mother's life and the impact of her murder on their family. She spoke of 36 years of unanswered questions, of holidays and milestones marked by Nancy's absence, of children who would never know their grandmother. Her testimony was a powerful reminder that behind the scientific evidence was a human tragedy that had affected multiple generations. The defense, led by attorney Philip Prokopowicz, faced the nearly impossible task of challenging DNA evidence that was statistically conclusive. Their strategy focused on the passage of time and the impossibility of conducting a fair investigation after 36 years. Key witnesses had died, memories had faded, and evidence had been lost or contaminated. Prokopowicz argued that Carbo's constitutional rights had been violated by the extended delay between crime and prosecution. The defense also suggested that the original investigation had been flawed, that other suspects had not been adequately explored, and that the focus on DNA evidence ignored other possibilities. But the genetic evidence was overwhelming. Expert after expert testified that the DNA samples from the crime scene matched Carbo with a probability that made error essentially impossible. The defense's arguments about time and memory were valid in principle, but couldn't overcome the scientific certainty that Carbo had been present during Nancy's murder. The trial lasted several weeks, with each day bringing Nancy's family closer to the resolution they had sought for so long. Carbo sat quietly throughout the proceedings, showing little emotion as the evidence against him mounted. His apparent indifference to the pain he had caused only reinforced the prosecution's portrayal of him as someone capable of terrible violence. As closing arguments approached, both sides prepared for the moment that would determine whether 36 years of waiting would finally result in justice for Nancy Daugherty. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning their verdict on a humid August afternoon in 2022. The courtroom was packed with Nancy's family, community members, and media representatives who had followed the case from arrest to trial. When the foreperson stood to announce the verdict, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. "Guilty," she said clearly, and the words seemed to echo through decades of pain and waiting. Michael Allen Carbo, Jr. had been convicted of first-degree murder in the death of Nancy Daugherty. Nancy's daughter collapsed into tears, her body shaking with sobs that contained 36 years of grief, frustration, and finally, relief. Around her, other family members wept openly, their emotions raw and overwhelming. The moment they had dreamed of for so long had finally arrived, but it felt surreal after such an extended wait. Carbo showed no reaction to the verdict, his expression remaining blank, as the judge thanked the jury and set a date for sentencing. His apparent lack of remorse or emotion struck many observers as consistent with someone capable of the brutal crime that had destroyed so many lives. Detective Whalen felt a profound sense of satisfaction as he watched the proceedings. The promise that Detective Waller had made decades earlier had finally been fulfilled. Science and persistence had triumphed over time, and the killer's belief that he had escaped justice forever. The media coverage was extensive, with headlines proclaiming "Justice after 36 years," and detailing the genetic genealogy breakthrough that had solved the case. The story became a symbol of hope for other families dealing with cold cases, proof that advances in technology could resurrect even the oldest unsolved crimes. That evening, a candlelight vigil was held outside Nancy's former home on 4th Avenue in Chisholm. Dozens of community members gathered to honor her memory and celebrate the verdict that had finally brought her killer to justice. The house itself had changed hands several times over the years, but it remained a powerful symbol of the innocence that had been lost on that terrible night in 1986. Nancy's daughter spoke briefly to the gathered crowd, thanking the investigators who had never given up and the community that had never forgotten her mother. But even in victory, she acknowledged that the verdict couldn't restore what had been taken away. Justice had been served, but Nancy would never come home. The conviction represented the end of one chapter in the family's long journey, but it was not yet the end of their story. Sentencing remained ahead, and with it, the final legal resolution of a case that had defined so many lives for so long. For one night, however, Nancy's family could rest in the knowledge that her killer would finally face the consequences of his actions. The celebration of justice was short-lived. In the months following Carbo's conviction, his defense team filed a series of appeals, challenging various aspects of the trial. The most significant appeal focused on the exclusion of evidence pointing to alternative suspects, particularly Brian Evenson. Attorney Philip Prokopowicz argued that the trial court had improperly prevented the defense from presenting evidence about Evenson's relationship with Nancy, his presence at the crime scene, and inconsistencies in his statements to police. The appeal claimed that this exclusion had violated Carbo's constitutional right to present a complete defense. The appellate process was agonizing for Nancy's family. After experiencing the relief of a conviction, they now faced the possibility that it could be overturned on technical grounds. The system that had finally delivered justice might yet snatch it away on procedural issues that seemed disconnected from the overwhelming DNA evidence. Legal experts debated the merits of the appeal in newspapers and television programs across Minnesota. Some argued that the passage of 36 years made any defense extremely difficult, and that excluding alternative suspect evidence was fundamentally unfair. Others contended that the DNA evidence was so conclusive that other theories were irrelevant distractions. Nancy's daughter found herself living in limbo once again, unable to fully grieve or heal, while the case remained in legal uncertainty. The conviction had felt like closure, but the appeal process reopened all the emotional wounds that had begun to heal. The Minnesota Supreme Court agreed to review the case in 2023, adding another layer of uncertainty to an already complex legal situation. The state's highest court would determine whether Carbo's conviction could stand or whether he would receive a new trial with different evidentiary rules. Detective Whalen continued working other cold cases, but Nancy's remained at the forefront of his attention. He had seen the joy on her family's faces when the conviction was announced, and the thought that it might be overturned was personally devastating. The DNA evidence hadn't changed. Carbo was still unquestionably Nancy's killer, but the legal system seemed to value procedural perfection over scientific certainty. As 2023 progressed toward the Supreme Court hearing, Nancy's family prepared for the possibility that they might have to endure another trial. The evidence that had convinced the first jury remained unchanged, but the legal landscape had shifted in ways that might benefit the defense. The appeal process highlighted one of the most frustrating aspects of the criminal justice system: the potential for technicalities to override clear evidence of guilt. But it also reflected the system's commitment to ensuring fair trials, even for defendants accused of the most heinous crimes. Nancy's family could only wait and hope that justice, once achieved, would not be undone by legal maneuvering. The crushing blow came on May 28, 2024, when the Minnesota Supreme Court issued its decision overturning Michael Allen Carbo, Jr.'s conviction. In a ruling that stunned prosecutors and devastated Nancy's family, the court held that the trial judge had erred in excluding evidence about alternative suspects, particularly Brian Evenson. The court's opinion acknowledged the strength of the DNA evidence but concluded that Carbo's constitutional right to present a complete defense had been violated. The justices ruled that the jury should have been allowed to hear evidence about Evenson's relationship with Nancy, his presence at the crime scene, and the inconsistencies in his statements to investigators. Nancy's daughter received the news while at work, and her collapse was so complete that co-workers had to drive her home. The woman who had waited 36 years for justice, who had finally seen her mother's killer convicted, now faced the reality that it had all been undone by legal technicalities. The decision meant that Carbo would receive a new trial, with different evidentiary rules that would allow the defense to present their alternative suspect theory. Despite the DNA evidence that conclusively placed him at the crime scene, he would once again be presumed innocent until proven guilty. Prosecutor Rebecca Gould announced that the state would absolutely pursue a retrial, but the task ahead was daunting. The same evidence that had secured the first conviction would be available, but now the defense would be able to muddy the waters with theories about other potential suspects. The news media covered the Supreme Court decision extensively, with legal experts debating its implications for cold case prosecutions throughout Minnesota. Some praised the court for protecting defendants' rights, while others criticized the decision as prioritizing procedure over justice. Brian Evenson, now living quietly in another state, learned of the decision through news reports. The ruling meant that his name would once again be associated with Nancy's murder. His past relationship with her scrutinized in open court. The DNA evidence had cleared him scientifically, but the legal system was prepared to revisit his potential guilt. For Nancy's family, the Supreme Court decision felt like losing her all over again. The closure they had experienced with the conviction evaporated, replaced by the familiar ache of uncertainty and delayed justice. They would have to endure another trial, relive the trauma of her murder, and face the possibility that her killer might escape conviction. The decision represented a fundamental tension in the criminal justice system between the pursuit of truth and the protection of defendants' rights. Both values were important, but for a family that had waited nearly 4 decades for justice, the court's emphasis on fair procedure felt like a betrayal. As summer 2024 progressed, preparations began for a second trial that no one wanted, but that the legal system now demanded. The preparation for Carbo's retrial consumed the final months of 2024, as both prosecution and defense teams rebuilt their strategies under the new evidentiary rules. Prosecutor Rebecca Gould knew that the DNA evidence remained overwhelmingly strong, but she also understood that the defense would now be able to present their alternative suspect theory in full. Attorney Philip Prokopowicz prepared to argue that Brian Evenson, not Michael Carbo, had killed Nancy Daugherty. The defense strategy would focus on Evenson's intimate knowledge of Nancy's routines, his presence at the crime scene as one of the people who discovered her body, and the inconsistencies in his statements to police over the years. The prosecution faced the challenging task of addressing these alternative theories while maintaining focus on the scientific evidence that conclusively identified Carbo as Nancy's killer. They would need to explain why DNA evidence trumped speculation about other suspects, no matter how compelling those theories might seem. Nancy's family prepared themselves for an even more emotionally difficult trial. Not only would they have to relive the trauma of her murder, but they would also have to listen as the defense attempted to shift blame to Brian Evenson, a man who had loved Nancy and had suffered under suspicion for decades. The media attention for the retrial was even more intense than it had been for the original trial. The Supreme Court's decision had generated national interest in the case, and legal experts from across the country weighed in on the balance between defendants' rights and victims' justice. Jury selection began in early January 2025, with both sides carefully screening potential jurors for any preconceptions about the case. The widespread media coverage meant that finding impartial jurors was extremely difficult, but eventually, 12 citizens were selected to determine Carbo's fate. As the second trial approached, everyone involved understood that this would likely be the final opportunity for justice in Nancy's case. The evidence hadn't changed, but the legal framework had shifted in ways that would test whether truth could prevail over doubt. Snow fell heavily outside the courthouse as the retrial prepared to begin, a reminder of the cold case that had finally been solved but not yet concluded. The second trial of Michael Allen Carbo, Jr., began on January 13, 2025, in a Duluth courtroom packed with spectators, media, and Nancy's family members who had endured this process once before. Judge Jill Eaton presided over proceedings that would determine whether nearly 4 decades of waiting would finally result in lasting justice. Prosecutor Rebecca Gould's opening statement was direct and powerful. She acknowledged that the defense would present alternative theories, but emphasized that DNA science provided objective truth that couldn't be disputed. Carbo's genetic material had been found at the crime scene, she argued, and no amount of speculation about other suspects could change that fundamental fact. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Gould began, we will present evidence that is not based on theory, not based on suspicion, not based on circumstance. We will present scientific proof that Michael Allen Carbo, Jr., was present in Nancy Daugherty's home when she was brutally murdered. The defendant's DNA was found on her body, under her fingernails. And at the crime scene, science doesn't lie. Defense attorney Philip Prokopowicz painted a different picture in his opening statement. He acknowledged that Carbo's DNA was present, but argued that its presence didn't necessarily indicate guilt. He suggested that Carbo and Nancy might have had a consensual encounter that night, clouded by alcohol or drugs, and that someone else had committed the murder afterward. The state wants you to believe that DNA evidence tells the whole story, Prokopowicz told the jury. But DNA can't tell you the context, the circumstances, or the timeline. It can't tell you that Brian Evenson had intimate knowledge of Nancy's home, that he was one of the last people to see her alive, that his statements to police contained significant inconsistencies. The prosecution's case proceeded much as it had in the first trial, with forensic experts explaining the genetic genealogy process and the statistical certainty of the DNA match. Crime scene investigators testified about the evidence collected in 1986, and medical examiners described Nancy's injuries and the violence she had endured. Nancy's daughter testified again, her voice steady despite the pain of reliving her mother's murder for the second time in open court. She spoke of Nancy's kindness, her impact on the community, and the decades of waiting for justice that had defined her family's existence. The defense cross-examination was more aggressive this time, with Prokopowicz challenging every aspect of the investigation and evidence collection. He questioned whether proper chain of custody had been maintained for evidence stored for nearly 4 decades, whether contamination might have occurred, and whether the genetic genealogy process was as reliable as prosecutors claimed. But the scientific evidence remained unshakable. Expert after expert confirmed that the DNA samples conclusively matched Carbo, with probabilities that made error virtually impossible. The genetic evidence had survived 39 years of storage and multiple analyses, maintaining its integrity and reliability. As the prosecution rested its case, the courtroom tension was palpable. Everyone understood that the defense phase would determine whether doubt could overcome scientific certainty. The defense's presentation of their alternative suspect theory transformed the courtroom into a stage for revisiting 4 decades of investigation and suspicion. Philip Prokopowicz methodically built his case against Brian Evenson, despite the DNA evidence that scientifically cleared him. Former investigators testified about Evenson's relationship with Nancy, his presence at the crime scene, and the inconsistencies in his statements over the years. Detective Sergeant Gary Waller, now retired and in his 80s, was called to testify about the original investigation and why Evenson had remained a person of interest for so long. Prokopowicz presented evidence of Evenson's jealousy regarding Nancy's other relationships, his intimate knowledge of her daily routines, and his emotional volatility during the period surrounding her murder. The defense argued that these factors, combined with his presence at the crime scene, made him a more logical suspect than Carbo. The strategy was risky but calculated. By presenting an alternative theory that seemed plausible, the defense hoped to create reasonable doubt about Carbo's guilt, despite the DNA evidence. They acknowledged that Carbo's genetic material was present but argued that it had been deposited during a consensual encounter unrelated to the murder. Brian Evenson himself was called to testify, his first public statements about the case in decades. Now in his 70s, He appeared frail and emotional as he recounted his relationship with Nancy and the trauma of being suspected of her murder for so many years. "I loved Nancy," Evenson testified, his voice breaking. "She was a good person. A kind person. I would never have hurt her. The suggestion that I could have done something so terrible, it's destroyed my life. I've lived under this cloud for 40 years. Under cross-examination, Prosecutor Gould challenged Evenson's timeline for the night of the murder and the inconsistencies in his various statements to police, but she also emphasized the DNA evidence that had cleared him scientifically, arguing that speculation couldn't overcome genetic certainty. "Mr. Evenson," Gould said during her questioning, "you've heard the DNA evidence in this case. You understand that your genetic material was not found at the crime scene, correct?" "Yes," Evenson replied quietly. "And you understand that Michael Carbo's DNA was found on Nancy's body and under her fingernails?" "Yes, I understand that." The defense also presented expert witnesses who questioned aspects of the DNA analysis and suggested alternative explanations for Carbo's genetic material being present at the scene. They argued that consensual contact could explain the DNA evidence and that the prosecution had failed to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Carbo was the killer. As the defense case concluded, the courtroom had heard two competing narratives: the prosecution's story of scientific certainty, pointing to Carbo's guilt, and the defense's theory of alternative suspects and reasonable doubt. The jury would soon have to decide which story they believed. The DNA evidence took center stage once again as the prosecution called its rebuttal witnesses to counter the defense's alternative theories. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead forensic geneticist who had analyzed the samples, provided detailed testimony about the conclusive nature of the genetic match. "The DNA profile we developed from the evidence matches Michael Carbo with a probability of 1 in 47 trillion, Dr. Chen testified. "To put that in perspective, there are only about 8 billion people on Earth. The statistical certainty of this match is beyond any reasonable doubt." The prosecution also called Detective Jason Whalen to testify about the genetic genealogy process that had identified Carbo as a suspect. Whalen explained how the investigation had proceeded methodically through family trees and DNA databases, ultimately leading investigators to a man who had lived within a mile of Nancy's home in 1986. Prosecutor Gould used the rebuttal phase to address the defense's alternative suspect theory directly. She argued that while Brian Evenson had been a person of interest in the original investigation, modern DNA science had definitively cleared him and identified the real killer. "Ladies and gentlemen," Gould told the jury, "the defense wants you to ignore science in favor of speculation. They want you to disregard genetic evidence that is more reliable than fingerprints, more certain than eyewitness testimony. They want you to convict an innocent man while letting the real killer escape justice." The prosecution's final witness was Nancy's daughter, who testified about the impact of her mother's murder on their family and the importance of holding the correct person accountable for the crime. "My mother was a victim of horrible violence," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But if you convict the wrong person, if you let Brian Evenson become a victim of false accusations while my mother's real killer goes free, then you'll have created another tragedy. The DNA evidence shows who killed my mother. Please believe the science." The defense's cross-examination was brief, with Prokopovich maintaining that DNA evidence alone couldn't tell the complete story of what happened that night in 1986. He continued to argue that alternative explanations remained possible, and that the prosecution hadn't met the burden of proving guilt beyond reasonable doubt. As the evidence phase concluded, both sides prepared for closing arguments that would frame the case for the jury one final time. The DNA evidence remained the strongest element of the prosecution's case, but the defense had succeeded in introducing doubt about the circumstances surrounding its deposit. Judge Eaton reminded the jury that their decision must be based on evidence, not sympathy or speculation. The scientific proof that had taken nearly 4 decades to develop would soon be weighed against theories of alternative suspects and reasonable doubt. Nancy's family sat in the front row, their faces etched with exhaustion and anxiety as they prepared to hear whether justice would finally be achieved. The closing arguments began on the morning of January 30, 2025, with prosecutor Rebecca Gould delivering a passionate plea for justice based on scientific truth. She walked the jury through the DNA evidence one final time, emphasizing the mathematical certainty of the genetic match and the reliability of the forensic analysis. Members of the jury, Gould began. For nearly 40 years, Nancy Daugherty's killer thought he had escaped justice. He believed that time would protect him, that evidence would degrade, that memories would fade. But he didn't count on the power of modern science to reach back through the decades and identify him conclusively. Gould addressed the defense's alternative suspect theory directly, arguing that speculation about Brian Evenson couldn't overcome the genetic evidence that pointed to Carbo's guilt. She reminded the jury that Evenson's DNA had not been found at the crime scene, despite his presence there as one of the people who discovered Nancy's body. The defense wants you to ignore the strongest evidence in this case, evidence that is more reliable than fingerprints, more certain than eyewitness testimony, Gould continued. They want you to convict an innocent man based on suspicion while letting the real killer escape justice. Don't let that happen. Nancy Daugherty deserves better. Her family deserves better. This community deserves better. Defense attorney Philip Prokopowicz countered with a closing argument that emphasized reasonable doubt and the complexity of human relationships. He acknowledged the strength of the DNA evidence but argued that its presence didn't necessarily indicate guilt of murder. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Prokopowicz said, the prosecution wants you to believe that DNA evidence tells the whole story, but science can't tell you about human emotions, about complex relationships, about the difference between presence and guilt. Michael Carbo's DNA was found at the scene, yes, but that doesn't prove he committed murder. Prokopowicz reminded the jury of Brian Evenson's intimate knowledge of Nancy's home and routines, his emotional volatility, and the inconsistencies in his statements to police over the years. He argued that these factors created reasonable doubt about Carbo's guilt, regardless of the DNA evidence. The state has the burden of proving guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Prokopowicz concluded. They haven't met that burden. There are alternative explanations for the evidence, alternative suspects who had means, motive, and opportunity. You cannot convict Michael Carbo based on DNA alone when reasonable doubt exists. Prosecutor Gould had the final word in her rebuttal closing. She emphasized once again the mathematical certainty of the DNA match and the decades of waiting that Nancy's family had endured. Nancy Daugherty was brutally murdered in her own home nearly 40 years ago, Gould said, her voice filled with emotion. Her killer left his DNA at the scene, and modern science has identified him beyond any doubt. Don't let legal technicalities and alternative theories obscure the truth. Michael Allen Carbo, Jr. killed Nancy Daugherty. The evidence proves it. Justice demands that you find him guilty. As the closing arguments concluded, Judge Eaton provided final instructions to the jury about their legal obligations and the standards they must apply. The 12 citizens who would determine Carbo's fate retired to begin their deliberations. Nancy's family prepared for what they hoped would be their final wait for justice. The jury deliberated for nearly 8 hours over 2 days before reaching their verdict. The extended deliberation created anxiety for both the prosecution and Nancy's family, who feared that the defense's alternative suspect theory might have created enough doubt to prevent a conviction. On the afternoon of January 31, 2025, Judge Eaton received word that the jury had reached a decision. The courtroom filled quickly with spectators, media representatives, and Nancy's family members who had waited nearly 4 decades for this moment. Michael Allen Carbo, Jr., stood silently beside his attorney as the jury filed back into the courtroom. His expression remained blank, showing no emotion as he faced the 12 people who would determine whether he would spend the rest of his life in prison. Judge Eaton asked the jury foreperson if they had reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor," came the reply. The court clerk took the verdict form and handed it to the judge, who reviewed it silently before returning it to be read aloud. In the matter of the state of Minnesota versus Michael Allen Carbo, Jr., the foreperson began, on the charge of first-degree murder while committing criminal sexual conduct, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. The word guilty seemed to hang in the air for a moment before the courtroom erupted in emotion. Nancy's daughter collapsed into tears, her body shaking with sobs that contained nearly 4 decades of grief, frustration, and relief. Around her, other family members wept openly, their emotions raw and overwhelming. Carbo showed no reaction to the verdict, his expression remaining as blank as it had been throughout the trial. His apparent lack of remorse or emotion struck many observers as consistent with someone capable of the brutal crime that had destroyed so many lives. Judge Eaton thanked the jury for their service and set a date for sentencing. As the proceedings concluded, Nancy's family embraced Detective Whalen and Prosecutor Gould, thanking them for their dedication to seeking justice. Outside the courthouse, church bells tolled softly across Duluth, not in celebration, but in acknowledgement that justice had finally been achieved. The sound carried across the city like a prayer answered after decades of waiting. Nancy's daughter spoke briefly to the gathered media, her voice steady despite her tears. "This doesn't bring my mother back," she said, "but it means that her killer will finally face the consequences of his actions. We can finally have some peace." The conviction represented the end of one of Minnesota's longest cold cases, a testament to the power of persistence, advancing technology, and the refusal to let time erode the pursuit of justice. For Nancy's family, it was not triumph. It was truth. At last. The months following Carbo's conviction brought a complex mixture of relief and continued pain for Nancy's family. Justice had been achieved, but it couldn't restore the 39 years that had been stolen from them or bring back the woman whose murder had defined their lives. Carbo was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 17 years, meaning he would be eligible for release in his 70s. The sentence reflected both the severity of his crime and the decades he had already lived freely, while Nancy's family suffered without answers. The genetic genealogy breakthrough that had solved Nancy's case became a model for other cold case investigations across Minnesota and the nation. Detective Whalen received recognition for his work on the case, but he consistently deflected credit to the original investigators who had carefully preserved the evidence that ultimately led to Carbo's conviction. Brian Evenson, finally cleared by DNA evidence after decades of suspicion, attempted to rebuild his life away from the shadows that had haunted him since 1986. The trial had been painful for him as well, reopening old wounds and subjecting him to renewed scrutiny. But the scientific evidence had vindicated him completely, providing closure he had never expected to receive. Nancy's daughter became an advocate for other families dealing with cold cases, speaking at conferences and supporting legislation to fund genetic genealogy programs. Her mother's case had become a symbol of hope for countless families who continued to wait for justice. The house on 4th Avenue in Chisholm where Nancy had been murdered changed hands again, but it remained a landmark in the community's collective memory. Some residents walked past it with renewed appreciation for the justice that had finally been achieved. Others simply remembered a kind woman who had died too young and too violently. Detective Sergeant Gary Waller, the original investigator who had promised Nancy's family that her killer would be found, lived to see that promise fulfilled. Though retirement had taken him away from active duty, he attended Carbo's sentencing and finally felt the peace that comes with a case closed and justice served. The advancement of forensic science that had solved Nancy's case continued to revolutionize cold case investigations throughout the country. DNA evidence that had seemed inconclusive in 1986 was now providing definitive answers to crimes that had remained unsolved for decades. But for Nancy's family, the broader implications mattered less than the personal closure they had finally achieved. Their mother, daughter, and sister could finally rest in peace, knowing that her killer had been identified, convicted, and sentenced. The coldest case in Chisholm's history was cold no longer. On a warm afternoon in early October 2025, Nancy's daughter knelt beside her mother's grave in the small cemetery outside Chisholm. The headstone was weathered by 4 decades of Minnesota seasons, but the inscription remained clear. Nancy Daugherty, beloved mother and friend. She placed fresh flowers beside the stone, yellow roses, her mother's favorite, and sat quietly in the grass that had grown over the grave where Nancy had rested for so long without justice. The silence was peaceful now, different from the angry silence that had characterized the years of waiting. "We kept our promise, Mom," she whispered, her voice carried away by the gentle breeze that rustled through the trees. "It took almost 40 years, but we found him. We never gave up, just like you would never have given up on us." The conviction had brought closure, but not the kind of dramatic resolution that movies and television shows portrayed. There had been no moment of pure triumph, no complete healing of wounds that had been open for decades. Instead, there was simply the quiet satisfaction of truth finally revealed and justice finally served. Nancy's grandchildren, born long after her death, now knew the story of their grandmother's life and the long fight for justice that had followed her murder. They understood that evil had touched their family, but they also understood that love, persistence, and faith had ultimately prevailed. The community of Chisholm had moved forward as well, but Nancy's case remained part of its collective memory. The small town that had been shattered by her murder had been slowly healed by the knowledge that her killer had finally been held accountable. The fear that had lingered for decades was finally lifting. Detective Whalen continued working cold cases, carrying Nancy's photograph in his case files as a reminder of what persistence and advancing technology could accomplish. Her case had become his most significant professional achievement, but it was also deeply personal. A promise fulfilled to a family that had never stopped believing in justice. Michael Allen Carbo, Jr., began serving his life sentence in silence, offering no explanation for his actions and no apology to Nancy's family. His conviction had closed one chapter in their lives, but he remained a figure of incomprehension. A young man who had destroyed an innocent life for reasons that might never be fully understood. As the sun set over the Iron Range, casting long shadows across the cemetery, Nancy's daughter stood and prepared to leave. The flowers would wilt with time, but they represented something that would endure: the love of a family that had never forgotten, and the justice that had finally been achieved. The coldest case in Minnesota history had found its resolution not in dramatic confrontation or sudden revelation, but in the quiet persistence of science, law enforcement, and a family's refusal to let time erase the truth. Nancy Daugherty could finally rest in peace, knowing that her story had ended not with unanswered questions, but with justice served and a family's long wait finally over. In Chisholm, Minnesota, the lights came on in houses along 4th Avenue as evening approached. The street that had once symbolized fear and unanswered questions now represented something different: the power of truth to survive even the longest winter, and the possibility that justice, however delayed, could still prevail. The case was closed. The wait was over. Nancy's story had finally reached its end.